In this video, I want to walk you through the Malthusian model from Chapter 2 of the Economy and talk about an application of it to the Great Irish Famine, as well as the application that we discussed in class to the Black Death. So the Malthusian model of population is built out of two components or relationships. The first component is the idea that population growth in an economy is going to depend on real wages per person or food output per person. And so remember that in this model we think of food output per person or real wages or income per person as representing the same thing. And so the idea here is that when people have better nutrition because there's more food, they are more resilient when it comes to diseases and so forth, and that will tend to lower the death rate and thereby increase the rate of population growth. Another sort of mechanism through which that might work is through the earlier marriage and higher birth rates during marriage that result in some European societies where marriage tends to be delayed until a couple has acquired a sufficient amount of income to establish a household of their own. So when food output per person is higher, population growth is higher, and when its food output per person is lower, that population growth rate is less. And in particular, there's a level of food per person which we call subsistence, which is that level at which population growth is is zero. And so above subsistence, population growth is going to tend to be positive, and population will expand. If food per person is below subsistence, then population growth is going to be negative and the population is going to fall. The second principle is that in agriculture, and we're imagining an economy here that is entirely composed of agricultural producers, there's diminishing average product of labor. And so that means that as there's sort of more population farming the land, while the total amount of output from agriculture is going to go up as you have more people farming, the average amount that's produced is going to decline, and that's because the marginal product of labor in agriculture is falling. So that means that when we have more people around, the food output per person is going to be less. So on this slide, we're going to take the two principles that we just discussed and represent them on a diagram. So the right-hand side of this diagram captures the first principle. This diagram has real wages or food output per capita on the vertical axis and population growth on the horizontal axis, where we have a 0 point here that represents zero population growth. Population growth is positive to the right of 0 and negative to the left of it. And so on these axes, we've drawn a red line, and that red line tells us for any given level of real wages here what population growth is going to be. So for real wages above this point, A prime, population growth is going to be positive, and so population will rise. For levels of real wages or food output per person below A prime, the red line tells us that the population will be falling. And so the way you read this right-hand diagram is you look for a level of real wages, and then you extend that out to the red line, and then you look down and see that population growth is positive, or if you're below A prime here, you go over to the red line and see that it's negative. Okay, so that's how the first principle is represented on the diagram. The left-hand graph represents the second principle with this blue line. And so that tells us, the blue line tells us, for any given population level, what is the level of real wages or food output per person that's going to be produced by the agricultural economy. And so if population is here at this level, that means that the real wages that agriculture is going to produce is at the subsistence level here. So you'll recall that when we're thinking about economic models, we're looking for the equilibrium, or the sort of state of the system of economic variables where nothing is changing. And in this Malthusian model, that happens when population growth is zero. So if population is not changing, then wages are not changing either, and we are in an equilibrium. So the way you would read the equilibrium of the model is to look for the sort of zero population growth level of wages, and read over to the left-hand diagram, and that subsistence level of wages is going to tell us what level of population is consistent with zero population growth. And so this is a model that tends to stability. And so if for some reason population is below or above this level, the forces of population growth or contraction from the right-hand side diagram are going to push. So here's an example of that. Remember that we talked about how the Black Death or bubonic plague of the 1300s in Britain caused a large decline in population over a fairly short period of time. So what would happen if we went from this equilibrium situation here to one where, because of forces that are not really related to the variables in the model, so we're not talking about something that's happening in agriculture, for example, or in the resilience of the population to disease or marriage patterns, these factors that we talked about the blue and red lines representing, something that's not a part of the model, what we call an exogenous shock, leads the population to decline. How will the model cope with that? The population decline will be very rapid, so we're imagining it sort of happening in a blink of an eye, and that means that at this lower level of population, there are fewer people farming the land, and while that does mean that the total amount of agricultural output goes down, the average amount per person, or the real wage, goes up. So the economy moves to this point B, and wages are high. Now, is B an equilibrium? Well, let's look at what level of population growth is associated with this high wage level by reading over to the right-hand side diagram to this point B prime. And we see that the high level of wages is consistent with positive population growth. That means that this low level of population is not an equilibrium. We are going to see changes happening, and the changes that are going to happen are going to push population up toward the initial level, And as population grows, wages are going to fall because there are going to be more farmers around, and those farmers are going to have lower average food output per person, consistent with the blue line. So what happens is that when we have a sudden decline in population in a Malthusian economy, wages increase for a time, but because wages are going to be higher, population will grow. As population grows, wages are going to fall, and the equilibrium level of wages that are consistent with the stable population, that's something that has not been changed at all by this sudden decline in population. And that means that we're going to, over time, get back to point A, where we started with. Now I want to turn to talk about the Great Irish Famine of 1845 to 1850. You might be thinking about the connection between famine and the Black Death, which we just talked about. So both of those things are have associated with them large declines in population, but the way in which the Malthusian model will sort of tell us something quite different about what is going to happen during famine. And so Ireland was a largely agricultural country in 1845, which means that our Malthusian model is perhaps a good fit. And the poorest third of the population depended on eating potatoes almost exclusively. So potatoes are very important. In 1845, a fungus that's known as potato blight arrives in Ireland, and it has a catastrophic effect on the potato harvest. So the potato harvest falls a great deal over the following 3 years, and sort of reaches maybe its lowest level in 1847. And so we can see from the graph on the right-hand side here that Ireland is producing almost 15,000 tons of potatoes in 1844. When the blight arrives, that falls catastrophically to a low of around only 2,000 tons. And so this is a decline in the availability of food such that people are no longer able to, many people are no longer able to survive on the farm produce that they can make. And the more dependent people are on the potato, the worse off they are. So during the famine years of 1845 to 1850, almost 1 million people die. Or 1/8 of the entire population of Ireland, which is a huge death toll for a famine, much larger than most 20th century famines as a share of the population. Really an enormous catastrophe. Now, how do we connect this to our Malthusian model? Well, what the potato blight does is causes a reduction in the productivity of agricultural labor. So before, people who are working in potato fields would be able to get, a substantial amount of potatoes out of the ground for their labor. When the potato blight is rampant across the country, that all that work that people are doing are yielding many fewer potatoes than before. And so while there are lots of deaths here, the mechanism is not coming from outside of the Malthusian model, so from a disease that's not related to agricultural production like the Black Death, but one that's intimately connected with it. And so what that means is that when we return to our Malthusian model, the way that we represent what happens to the Irish economy because of the potato blight is different than what we did for the Black Death. So the average output of food per person is going to fall, and we represent that by a shift in this blue line that gives us the relationship between real wages and population down. So this line shifts down and to the left. That's the shock that happens to Irish agriculture. What does the model predict is going to happen? Well, the initial effect is that wages are going to fall to a starvation level, and at that sort of starvation level of wages, population growth is going to be highly negative. And the way in which population growth is highly negative here is that people are starving to death because they cannot get enough food to sustain life. So then what happens? So people are starving. What happens to the economy over time? Well, as there are fewer people around because of the high death rates, the population is going to fall. And when the population is lower, wages are going to rise again. So the Malthusian model predicts that what will happen is that many people will die as there are fewer people around who need to live off the produce of the land. The average output per person is going to rise again according to the light blue schedule. And then we'll end up with a country that still has the same subsistence level of wages as it did before, but with a smaller population. So that's what the Malthusian model says is likely to happen when we have a decline in agricultural productivity like this in a sort of subsistence level agricultural society. Now, how do these predictions sort of interact with the policy decisions that governments can take? And so you may know that Ireland was a colony of the United Kingdom during this era. And so the model predicts that the population is going to decline through starvation. What can this United Kingdom government do? Is it helpless to sort of save people from starvation? What kinds of policies should it adopt to prevent deaths? Well, one thing that it could do would be to import food and feed people until the blight has passed. And so this would be the best course of action to do if we thought that the blight and its reduction in agricultural productivity was a temporary thing, maybe lasting for only a few years, but then something that could be recovered from. I should note that just importing the food is not enough, because people who are deprived of their livelihood from growing potatoes are not going to have any income available from any other sources to buy food that's imported. So you have to bring in the food and give it to people to support them until things have recovered in agriculture and the blight is no longer a factor. To the extent that the blight is going to be long-lasting or even permanent, the Malthusian model tells us that under a permanent reduction in the productivity of agriculture, the sort of population that can be supported at a minimal level on the land of Ireland has fallen. And so the only way to save the lives of the excess population is to help them to emigrate to a country where they can make a living. And so during the course of the famine, British policy tried to some extent to do both of these things, although not nearly to the level that was that would have ameliorated the disaster. And so you can, if you're interested in that, you can, and in the famine more generally, you can read the Irish economic historian Cormac O'Grada's book Black 47 and Beyond. And so the consequence of the famine and to some extent the policy were that by 1850 there had been 1 million deaths, but also 1 million people had emigrated due to the famine. Only some of those with the support of either their landlords or the British government, and the population of Ireland fell by about 25%. As it turned out, the potato blight was not a permanent feature of Irish agriculture in the sense that it reduced irrevocably the productivity of Irish agriculture. It came and went. There were large failures of the potato crop due to blight later in the 19th century as well, but there was some recovery in general in the productivity of potato agriculture. But nevertheless, the large-scale outmigration that was sparked by the famine sort of started a trend that continued during the 19th century. And so the population of Ireland fell from a high of around 8 million to around 4 million by the outbreak of the Second World War. And this was during a time in which the population of Europe as a whole was increasing pretty steadily.